Accountability Task Force. We're glad that you joined us today. In just a moment, I'll talk about the agenda and what we hope to accomplish in our time this morning. But why don't we start by letting everybody introduce themselves. I do think it's, even if we already have done this once and we know each other, I think it's time well spent so we can make sure we can hear from everybody. We do want to make sure that we've got a good connection and that we're well suited to communicate easily this morning. So I'll just go down the list that you see displayed here in this slide. And when I say your name, if you kindly just greet everybody, maybe tell us your organization and your position, and we'll proceed that way. Karen Howard.
I'm Karen Howard, and I'm the principal of Bell Shivers Middle School in Aberdeen, Mississippi.
Great. Good morning, Karen. Thank you for being here.
Good morning.
Kimmy Strain. Is Kimmy Strain with us this morning? Shalandia Washington. Is Shalandia Washington with us this morning? How about Anthony Goins?
Yes, Anthony Goins, Assistant Superintendent, Clinton Public School District, Clinton, Mississippi.
Great, thank you for joining us, sir. Ryan Kirkendall. Is Ryan with us this morning?
Yeah, good morning. Ryan Kirkendall, Director of Accountability and Research for DeSoto County Schools.
Great, thanks. Good morning, Ryan. Thanks for being here. Christy Hovanitz.
Hi, Christy Hovanitz, Senior Policy Fellow for Excel in Ed.
Great, good morning, Christy. Thanks for being here. Kenneth Pulley. Kenneth Pulley. How about Frederick Hickman?
Frederick Hickman, Kemper County School District Assistant Superintendent.
Thank you for being here. Greg Paxick.
Yeah, Greg Pazak, Madison County Schools, Director of Research and Development.
Good morning, Greg. We've heard from Alan, but you should go ahead and introduce yourself, Alan.
Alan Burrow, Executive Director of District School Performance, MDE.
Good morning to Alan. And Deborah Donovan.
Hi, Deborah Donovan, MDE, Director of Data Analysis and Reporting.
Good morning, Deborah. Dr. Paula Vanderford.
Good morning, Chief Accountability Officer.
Good morning, Paula. Jay Smith.
Jay Smith, Superintendent, North Pike School District.
Superintendent Smith. Richard Balico.
Good morning, Richard Balico, Assistant Superintendent, Nospy County School District.
Great. Thanks for being here this morning. Jacob Dykes.
Good morning. This is Jacob Dykes, Principal of Pecan Park Elementary School and Ocean Springs School District.
Great. We're glad you're here, Jacob. Fina Hentz. Is Fina Hentz with us this morning? How about Amanda Garcia?
Good morning. I'm Amanda Garcia, Assistant Principal at Petal High School.
Great. Good morning, Amanda. Rosemary Oldman. Is Board Member Oldman with us this morning?
She's not going to be able to join us today.
Okay. I'll introduce myself. Matt Thompson.
Good morning, Matt Thompson, Director of Federal Programs and Accountability, Union County School District.
Thanks for being here, Matt. Crystal Bates.
Good morning, Crystal Bates, Wayne County School District, Wayne County High School Curriculum.
Thank you, Crystal. We're getting an echo. I don't know who's in that's on, but just I don't know if others are hearing that. Let's try Tracy Cameron.
Good morning, Tracy Cameron, West Bolivar School District, Director of Curriculum and Instruction.
Good morning, Tracy. Thanks for being here. Let me just check with some folks that I didn't hear from. Kimmy Strain. Shalandia Washington, Kenneth Pulley, Fina. Oh,
I'm sorry, Shalandia Washington, Principal, Canton Elementary, Canton Public Schools.
thank you, ma'am. We're glad you're here. Fina Hentz. I think I heard that Ms. Altman's not available. Is there anybody who did not have an opportunity to introduce themselves? Okay. Before I
Chris, we do have Sandra Robinson that's with the agency. Are you on, Sandra?
Sandra, are you able to hear us okay? I see you in the participant list, but I don't hear from you yet.
Well, if she stepped away, she may need to join us for the second part of our meeting today regarding school improvement, but we'll introduce her at that time.
Thanks for pointing that out. Is there anybody else who hadn't had a chance to be introduced? Okay, so before I talk about the agenda and cover some introductory notes and get into the content, I want to give the department a chance to provide any opening remarks. Mr. Burrow or Dr. Vanford, does anybody have any kind of opening remarks to make?
I don't have any other than just thanking everyone for their participation. I think some of the conversations that we've had among the leadership will come out in the conversation today. We're hearing everything that you can imagine from across the state with heightened anxiety about the calculations and what accountability will look like this year. Also some conversation about some bills that are currently hanging in the balance at the legislature. And so all of you know, this is what we face every year. And we just have to just keep our eye on what's happening across the street, as well as, focusing on adhering to the federal and state requirements that are currently in place. And as we've emphasized on our calls with Dr. Domaleski and in our conversations with many of you, we just want to ensure that the results that are produced in the fall adequately and accurately represent what has transpired through the pandemic. We don't want any type of misleading or inflation of any of the results, because we go back and use data that may be inappropriate to include that occurred prior to the pandemic. And so I think all that, as Dr. Domaleski, has mentioned to MDE staff, will, be addressed in the conversations that we have. But I just want to you to know that that's the agency's position, that we do want an accurate reflection of what has occurred during the pandemic as we move forward in complying with both federal and state requirements for the producing accountability results.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vanderford. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Alan. Let me just spend a moment sketching the agenda broadly, and then just a few more housekeeping things before we get into the first topic area. Our plan for today is we're going to return to high school growth, as I'll explain when we get there in just a couple of minutes. I think it's just 2 days after our last meeting, federal guidance for accountability dropped. And so that's caused us to have to really reflect on a lot of the conversations that we had at that time and some of the options that were discussed. And frankly, it takes some things off the table, and we'll talk about what that means, what we've learned since then, and how that informs what's going to be a streamlined set of options that we want to certainly talk through with the task force, get your advice and reactions to. After that topic, we'll take a break, and then we're going to shift to talk about ESSA classification decisions. That is, we're specifically going to talk about how we'll approach making determinations about CSI schools and ATSI schools that become CSI schools because of potentially consecutive designations as ATSI. And we'll explain all that carefully when we get to that topic. We'll end as we have our usual tradition, going around the horn and asking people to provide any additional remarks, perhaps help us prioritize future meeting topics, and then we'll cover action items and next steps. We will provide a written record of the meeting. I believe you received that from Mr. Burrow yesterday. I hadn't planned to go over those meeting notes now, but I will pause to say if you've, because I know they've only been in your inbox a very short time. So if you have any initial comments on those meeting notes, I'd be happy to hear from you now. But we'll keep them in draft form for another week or two to give you a chance to carefully review. And if you want to email Mr. Burrow any comments you have on those, we can make revisions if that's appropriate. But let me pause there to in particular to see if there's any feedback on the meeting notes or any other questions or comments you have before we get into the agenda today. All right, hearing none, and you guys certainly know by now, you won't ruffle my feathers if at any point you want to chime in with any particular suggestions, comments, or feedback, even if it means that we rewind and do that. That's perfectly fine to me. We want to have a tone here at these meetings where they're conversational, where we really have free discourse among the members. So I hope that you feel free to do that. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we just remind folks of a few things about the task force. Our purpose is to help the department make good decisions about design and implementation of the state school accountability system that's required under the federal ESSA legislation. We try to focus more on policy priorities as opposed to technical aspects. We know that there are certainly technical aspects, but we want to make sure they're in service to a strong rationale and a persuasive policy priority. So that's how we try to organize the conversations and how we try to elicit your advice. And I think we've made the point before that feedback from the task force is received as a recommendation from the department. Department certainly has multiple avenues for vetting and getting feedback. Certainly the accountability task force is an important voice among many. Next slide, please. We've covered these, so I don't think it's necessary to linger on it, but really just helps remind us that as we approach these conversations, we want to have the kind of atmosphere where everybody has a chance to be heard and get respectful feedback. And we know that we don't always agree on everything all the time, but we'll work to respond to the ideas and not make inferences about people or motivations. And you know, I mentioned in the past, we'll attempt to make decisions in the best case by group consensus. If we can build towards unanimity in our decision making, that's best case, and we'll keep the conversation going as long as that looks like that's an option that we can reach. But if not, then we may have occasions we have had in the past where we say it's best to take a vote in order to understand what the recommendations of the task force are. And if there's a point of view that is not the majority point of view, then we'll just make sure that's reflected carefully in the notes, because we really want to honor everybody's perspective, even if it doesn't emerge as the majority perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to get into the content, and I should also note here before we dive in, we've allotted 4 hours for this meeting. We think there's a decent chance that we won't need all that time, but it should. We actually don't have a lot of material to present. We have some, but we've just left lots of space open for conversation. And if they're, we'll be able to talk about each of these topics for a little more than an hour each, if that's the pleasure of the committee, and if we're having productive conversations. But if it moves more quickly, we know that you're busy and we will give you time back. So just know we'll stay flexible on that. But thank you for encumbering the morning for our meeting time. Next slide. I think we're going to start with just a little reminder about growth and why this is a topic and what problems we're trying to solve. We know that high school accountability in particular pertains to the cohort of current 10th graders, and those, in order to calculate growth, we're going to need a score in Algebra 1 and in English 2 for those 10th graders. So we think of those as either outcome scores or dependent variables, and those come from those come from typically 9th grade for Algebra 1 and 10th grade for English 2, and their prior score would typically come from 8th grade math and 8th grade ELA, respectively. But we know there's a number of patterns there, and we'll talk about that here in a little more detail. We talked about that last meeting, but just to help get everybody's head back around what we're doing here. But students can take those in multiple grades, and depending on when they took the test or when they should have taken the test, if it was during a COVID disrupted year, we've got some challenges in terms of where we get the outcome score, where we get the prior score. So that's why this topic has been elevated. We think it's one of the most prominent challenges to restoring accountability in 2022. So that's just describing the general banking situation. I feel like many of you are probably very well familiar with it, but we didn't want to go past that too briskly. Next slide, please. So I mentioned in my introductory remarks that I think our last meeting was December 15th, and then on December 17th, the Department of Education released some draft guidance. And you see some excerpts from it here to support SEAs, state education agencies, and local education agencies and schools as they implement accountability and school improvement requirements. There's a link for that. If you haven't seen it, you can probably put a Google search in for Department ESSA accountability guidance and find that pretty quickly. One of us could send that to you as well if you're not able to find it after the meeting. The document covers a wide range of areas. It really focuses on temporary adjustments consistent with statutory requirements that may be needed in the short term because of missing or less reliable data. Next slide, please. The headline of this guidance, many folks, including myself, are really interested to see what kind of posture the feds would take, but really the headline in bold is the feds have affirmed accountability and school identification requirements in effect. We've had a number of conversations with the department since then, both in group settings and in some individual communications, and they've been very consistent in this message. It really is a message from the feds that accountability must be in place for the 21-22 academic year. It must draw on data from this year. It must be comparable and statewide and meet all statutory requirements. And so what they've tried to do in the guidance is come up with some illustrations of some technical choices that states can make in order to fulfill those statutory requirements. And the general principle that you'll find throughout the guidance is if the state wants to make a one-time change, particularly to get through this year in accountability, there are some alternatives that are available, and there's a streamlined way that the state can apply to implement those alternatives. But any lasting changes or any permanent changes to accountability would require a full amendment to the accountability system, and there's a way that the state departments have to proceed if that's the choice as well. It's pertinent to us because something like skip year growth, which we talked about last time, and that we'll renew that conversation again today, is an example of what I mean by those temporary adjustments. So if there's a fix that needs to be made in the near term that would not be the state's lasting solution, then the guidance is set up to be friendly to those kinds of alternatives. Let me see, I think I talked through most of the bullets on this slide, but let me take a moment to see if that's the case. Yeah, there's some language in there about shifting timelines forward. There is an invitation to modify exit criteria for schools identified in fall 2022. We're actually going to talk about that in the second half of our meeting today. Important to note that participation requirements are in place. And the only exception is for high school students who tested in the 1920 year for states that are using an in-course test. And that kind of language exactly applies to a state like Mississippi. It's essentially permission saying if you're doing banking and you would have drawn from tests in the 1920 academic year, which of course was the year that the feds waived testing requirements, that's the only case where participation would be relaxed. All other participation requirements are in place. Really want to just emphasize again the language about indicators being statewide and comparable, because it impacts what we're going to be talking about today. And as you see from the last note there, some of the options really move off the table based on our read of the guidance and our subsequent conversations with federal officials. Next slide. So it really leads us to this place. We believe that, well, we know actually, because we asked about this particular point, that any solution, if you remember from our December meeting, we talked about a better of the two alternative, where we said, let's calculate skip year growth and or legacy growth and consider using the better of the two. That's off the table because it's not statewide and it's not comparable, and also because it would create a situation where some schools may have data not drawing on the procedures applicable for the current academic year. It also, I know we talked at length at the previous meeting about an option where we looked at older banked data, maybe data that was banked prior to the pandemic, and recover that for use and accountability in the 21-22 year. We understand now that that too is off the table because of its disruption to the accountability system, because it's a lack of reliance on recent data. So in our judgment, and I realize this may not sound like the news you'd hope to hear at this meeting, but in our judgment, that really focuses us on two options. And the first option is, both options rely on skip year growth, which I'll give everybody a quick reminder of here on the next slide. But skip year growth when the growth priors are missing, and we think the decision point that distinguishes between the options are if the outcome test, which could be Algebra 1 or English 2, overwhelmingly we're talking about Algebra 1, friends. So overwhelmingly this is talking about students who may have taken Algebra 1 as 8th graders. That would have been in the 1920 academic year. When that's missing, we think we have a decision to make whether just to remove those from the accountability score altogether, just remove it from the numerator or the denominator. As I mentioned a moment ago, federal guidance permits that for that one isolated case, or we would propose to use a legacy score. It'd have to be approved by the feds, but the department is prepared to submit that as a request, particularly if it's something that the Accountability Task Force endorses. So the two options are, with skip year growth, what do we do about those missing Algebra 1 scores from the 1920 academic year? Do you just leave them out and compute with what's left over, or do you use the student's prior growth score? And I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. So here's just an illustration. We saw this at the previous meeting, but I thought it might be helpful just to remind everybody. I really think that that second arrow is probably the one that most pertains to the conversation today. What we'd be proposing is to take for students that took algebra as a 9th grader. That's the most common scenario in Mississippi. Their prior score would come from 2019, their 7th grade math score, and that would be their growth calculation. Obviously, if the student tested in 10th grade, that's the top line, then we'd be using their 7th grade math score, and then in the last row there, this is where we have the decision about legacy growth or missing. In that case, the outcome measure is the one that's shaded. It's the grade 8 Algebra 1 score that just isn't available. And so we'd say, do we look back and check that student's growth score in 2019, which presumably came from a 6th to 7th grade trajectory, or do we just leave that out of the calculation? Next slide, please. Here's the illustration for ELA. Again, it's going to be very, very rare that we wouldn't have an outcome score. In most cases, it would be grade 10 English 2 using grade 7 as a prior. And then there'll be some students who have grade 9 English 2 also using the 2019 scores as a prior. And the next slide, please. Yeah, this is just another view of the options, and it should look similar to what we talked about in December. Again, the difference is that we're not talking about doing the better of the two. In this case, it's really that that last line on math that is the distinguishing characteristic. If student took Algebra 1 in grade 8, then no growth would be calculated under option 1. That's what this slide is. And the next slide, please, is option 2, which is to use the legacy score. Everything else stays the same. I think I have one more slide, and I promise I will stop talking at you and open it up for conversation. You've been patient. Department did take a look at the data. We thought one question that may be on your mind is what would be the impact? We sort of hypothesized that using legacy scores would have a favorable impact, and the data seemed to support that. Great credit to Deborah, who ran a number of analyses, and it's just summarized at a high level here. She located growth scores in 2019 for all students who were missing algebra in 2020. And so, those 2019 growth scores would have been based on, I think, the grade 6 to 7 growth trajectory. And we say, well, what if we put those into the model? What kind of impact would we see statewide? You'd see 232 of those students would have no growth, but the overwhelming majority of students, 605, would get a growth score of 1, and 1,486 would get a growth score of 1.25. So there certainly is, those students, as we hypothesized, represent capable math achievers, and I think the growth data bears that out. And so the impact to districts and schools will generally be more favorable, is the headline, if we choose option 2, which is to import the legacy data. We never want to make accountability decisions based on impact, but we know that it's reasonable to give you good information to think through these topics. So I believe that's the last bit of introduction information I have. The next slide just reminds us of the discussion questions. Oh, no, I don't even have that. Just so let's go backwards so we can just have folks take a look at the options. I think slide 12 probably would be the right slide for people to take a look at as we talk. We believe these are our strongest options, and we wanted to open it up for conversation from the task force. So I know I gave you a lot of information. You may have some questions that you want clarified, but let's do open the floor. And feel free to either use the hand raise or just speak right up.
So staying with this topic, do we have 2021 data compared against 8th grade as the baseline, and then 7th grade as the baseline for ELA and algebra?
Meaning like full accountability results, not just growth?
No, just the growth, like what it would be. I know you pulled in the legacy data right there, but do we have how it would have been different? Like if you would have used 7th grade as the baseline as opposed to 8th grade for 2021 students? With the ones you could, for instance, like 10th grade.
Yeah.
I think is that we talked about that. We shared some data at last meeting on skip year growth. Let me see if that answers your question. Ryan, I'll take a quick look at my file and see. Alan, do you have the December slides handy? I might be able to share. It's slide starts with slide 45 in December. We could give folks another look at.
Okay, let me which slide did you say?
Slide 45. It's at it's the last 3 slides of the growth presentation in December. And I'm not 100% sure, Ryan, this is what you're asking, but at least we can see what we showed you at the last meeting was just the difference between skip year and standard growth for math and for reading. Yeah, here it is. And yeah, in general, it's quite similar. So skip year growth is slightly higher for language arts, for reading language arts, and it's slightly lower for math. It's you see those histograms there. These are at the school level, and Deborah might correct me if I say this wrong. And those tall bars in the histogram show schools that had no difference in growth results, so 0 delta between skip and standard growth. And then everything to the right of that tall bar shows schools that did better with skip year growth, and everything to the left of the tall bar shows the frequency of schools that did a little worse. You can see the scale ranges on math from about -20 to +20, and it's a little broader. Although this is just math. I think I have a separate slide for reading after this. Okay. Thanks for being patient with me. The left one is for overall growth, and then the right one is for low growth. I could read my own chart headers would be helpful. But yeah, so math, it's slightly less, slightly lower for math. And then if you skip to the next one for reading, it's a little more favorable. And I think you'll see a little more variability if you go to, yeah, here we are. So yeah, overall growth on the left, low growth on the right. And if you can't see those tiny numbers, you can, and we'll go back to math in a second. But you see that the mean is a little bit, it's a little bit on the positive side. It's 1.42 for reading overall, and I think it's 0.53 for reading low growth, which shows that on average, most schools got a little bump. And then for mathematics, if you want to go backwards again, the mean is -1.38, meaning most schools got a little bump in the unfavorable direction, and -1.67 for low growth. So yeah, I think those are the main data that we produced for last month.
And these, Chris, are data that are non-COVID impacted. So skip year not impacted by COVID versus standard not impacted by COVID. So listening to what Paula had said at the beginning, that we want the most accurate reflections of what happened during the COVID years, it doesn't sound like using legacy data would provide an accurate picture of what happened during the COVID years. So I guess right now I'm kind of leaning towards option one. But one of the questions I had is, what percent of students, I know Deborah showed us the impact of students without and what the impact would be, but what percent of students wouldn't have data this year that we're calculating growth for? So is it, half the students? Is it 10% of the students? Just kind of getting a feel for who we wouldn't be calculating growth for, I guess is, I think, my first question.
Yeah, Alan or Deborah will correct me, I hope, if I'm wrong, but didn't we, it's about 85% statewide that take algebra in 9th or 10th grade. So about 15% wouldn't have data. Is that right, Alan or Deborah?
It was actually 8.5% of students that take Algebra 1 in the 8th grade.
So we have 90+% of students that we will have data and information for growth this year without having to resort to use legacy scores. Right?
That's correct. You said 8% and change would have missing scores. So that's right, Christy. Now, of course, I recognize that will be variable by district and school. So some districts may have many more students who test in 8th grade than others. But that's a good point, Christy.
At the last meeting, a couple of us asked about an option of having a baseline year, removing the growth box in the school's rating. Can you explain why that's not an option under the new regulations that were released?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's really two reasons why we remove that as an option. One is the feds don't make states have growth, but they do require an additional academic indicator. And every state but one in the country uses growth for the additional academic indicator. So it's not a choice for Mississippi to say, we're not going to have the additional academic indicator. Now, technically, it's a choice for Mississippi to say, we'll use something else for that additional academic indicator. But that kind of gets to the second point, which is we really feel like anything that's not growth is, it's just going to be so status-based that it's just going to duplicate what proficiency is already doing, that we feel like it would be a substantial departure from the current model. So that was the thinking that inspired that.
So Deborah, what we're looking at here is the outcome score 18, 19, and then the baseline score, when you say standard growth, is going to be from 16, 17, and they're in 8th grade. When you say skip year growth, 15, 16, when they're in 7th grade, is that what we're looking at here? Or is this 2021 to 18, 19, 2021 to 17, 18? Do you understand my question?
I believe so, and I think I've run both scenarios. So Alan, I might need your help to determine which one was in this presentation.
Yeah, I mean, this was pre-pandemic data, so the intent was to look at the last year before the pandemic, where we had the pandemic impact. So it would be 18-19 data, looking back at both the prior and then a 2-year prior. So if we were to skip a year, see what the data would look like.
Yeah, but since this is a high school conversation, I am just making sure this is just high school we're looking at here, right? This is 10th grade to 8th grade and then 10th grade to 7th grade, correct? Just like we're making a decision about right now.
I believe this slide is all from the data back in December.
Other comments or suggestions? Dr. Hovanets mentioned that she felt like there was a rationale to prefer option one. I don't know if anybody has a response to her comment or wants to second that suggestion or offer another point of view.
Of the two options, I agree with what Christy said, leaning towards option one because of the impact of that legacy score pre-pandemic on outcomes.
Thank you.
I think you will find, staying with this conversation here, I think you will find if you since the losses were greater in math and historically across the state, 7th grade math is higher than 8th grade math, what you're going to find is this does impact math more post-pandemic. I've compared it both ways as well. So you're going to find that using 7th grade as the baseline for Algebra 1 is going to impact math a little bit more. ELA will be relatively close because 7th grade and 8th grade ELA across the state is a little closer historically. So again, I think if we're interpreting the USD guidance as you can't use 18, 19 points as a safety net, and obviously you're down to just a couple options here. I will say I read the USD guidance as well. You guys had I know you have inside conversations, so I'll trust what you guys found out. The only thing that I would like to see, they basically gave a lot of flexibility. They said you can really almost do anything if you just identify school improvement, mandate assessments, and have report cards, basically. So is there a way that we could discuss with them for a year or two at least, can we not have banking? Because that's the source of all of our problems. So could we just not have, ninth graders count the year they count, at least for a year or two, till we get out of these holes that we're in? I just wonder if that's something we could entertain, because when I looked at the USD guidance, it looked like they would almost entertain anything.
I think you're right when they say they'll entertain anything, which is to say that a state can submit or propose anything. Let's think about the banking for a second. So if we didn't bank, so presumably that suggestion, Ryan, would be to take an Algebra 1 score in whatever grade it was taken in 2022 and locate the student's prior score, if available, in 21. Yeah, so I think there'd still be some workarounds on the prior. So let's most students take algebra as a 9th grader. So if they took it as a 9th grader in 22, presumably look at their 8th grade score in 21. Those two sources of data should be relatively intact. If they took Algebra 1 as a 10th grader, I don't think they'd have a 9th grade math score, so you'd have to decide if you draw the 8th grade score, which of course would be an empty category, so you didn't have to go back to 7th grade, you have to do a skip year for the prior. So there'd be some different versions of skip year there. Yeah, I just wanted to talk it out loud. Thanks for letting me do that. But yeah, do I accurately reflect on what you're thinking about?
Yeah, and you still got to make this decision because what you just said, like 10th grade algebra students, well, they don't have an 8th grade score, so you still got to do one of these options. So to me, these options are hand in glove. They're looped. It's part of the same thing. So that's why that comes up in my head every time we talk about this. Obviously, we got to do one of these two options, but we also, we've got to deal with the situation where we're going to count. We're going to say we're going to count 9th grade scores in a year where everybody was told it was hold harmless. I think y'all know there's a lot of talk across the state. That's not going to go over well to teachers if you do that. So I'm just looking at options as a hand in glove with this. We got to decide this, but what helps me is thinking about. So it would really make things a lot more comparable. That's the word of the day. It sounds like make things a lot more comparable if we just ask the USD, could we count the scores when they take it that year, at least for a year or two. It would be great if we could do it forever.
Well, Ryan, I think the big challenge with that is the federal government requires you to test math in high school, which is why we got into that banking to begin with. And if we ask to calculate growth in the year in which the student took it, then we're going to have a whole bunch of kids that don't have a high school math test. So then that's going to propose them to say, now you need a different high school math test if you're using scores in 8th grade or 9th grade when the kids are actually taking Algebra 1. So that's how we kind of backed into this to begin with. And I don't think asking the ed to change the growth requirement I think is going to cause us more problems on the administration and proficiency side and having to add another math test.
So that I think answers a question that I was going to clarify. So if we went with this, so what we'd be asking the feds to do is basically exclude growth for multiple years for this group of students. I mean, is that right? I mean, and then I want to follow. So that's the question that I wanted to make sure that I was clear on in taking my notes. And then the other thing, Ryan, to your point about hold harmless, having a lot of conversations across the street about what those COVID relief waivers actually were. And so there was not, I mean, under that COVID waiver, that was a hold harmless under assessment. So people are conflating what that waiver did. It was not communicated or intended for anybody to perceive that as a hold harmless for accountability. I mean, those were all under the assessment requirements for both years, being year 1 and 20 when we did not assess. There was no assessment. And so then it was that applied to the graduation requirements for students that needed that end of course assessment or an option in lieu of to graduate. And then for last year, when we were administering the assessment, the board made their they voted and granted approval prior to the feds coming in and saying that, and we were relieved of that 95% participation rate. So that followed that. And then the agency, moved forward, encouraging all districts to meet we still wanted to meet our participation rate, and we did, and we exceeded it and had one of the highest participation rates in the nation. But that piece was for graduation. It was that the students, we would not prohibit the student from graduating if they did not meet a minimum cut on that assessment. And so just as a point of clarity, that hold harmless is being communicated across the state, that we said we would hold districts harmless for those assessments for the use and accountability. And that's, so we're having to explain that. And I just want to make sure people are clear on that.
Yeah, so let me speak to Christy's point first. I totally understand what you're saying. I was, I remember all that. We were discussing a geometry, algebra 2 test. I remember, I know, however, when I read the USD guidance, they understand the circumstances we have. So they seemed so flexible with anything you needed to do to make things comparable. Well, this is the best way to make things comparable, because if you're going to use something from last year into everything that you're using this year, and you just got this one little caveat, well, they were in 9th grade. But I do, and so my thought was, if they say no, they say no. But in a conversation, is it possible to ask, I guess was the one thing I was saying. But then the other thing is, Paul, I understand what you're saying. I think I understand the legalistic words, but I will tell you, I don't know that the teachers and the principals and legislators understood that. They see it as, well, I was a 9th grade teacher and I'm getting punished and no one else counted, and I was told these scores weren't going to hold harmless. The kids were told they didn't have to pass, and now you're going to count those to me. And it's during a year where we're having trouble staffing schools. We're just literally trying to have school, keep teachers here, sending out intent forms with, fingers crossed and prayer. So I just think we need to be aware of that. That's all I'm saying.
I think a couple other thoughts that might just inform the conversation. Yeah, now I'm having to think all the way back to like 2015, which is dangerous. But I think there was also that provision that gets that helps states evade double testing for having using this banked approach for high school accountability, and so this was the more rigorous option that allowed 8th grade students to take one test. Now, it may still fall under your comments, Ryan, that the sort of spirit of flexibility might permit those kinds of things. I suppose that's conjecture. But the other thing that's really been a conversation throughout, as we've been thinking about accountability solutions, is trying to maintain the system intact to the extent practicable to look at longitudinal performance over time. And I just think, I just feel like I have to say out loud, if we're changing some of the rules about where the scores are coming from for a transitional period of time, I realize skip year growth is one source of change that we don't take lightly, but if you combine that with removing banking and using a trend approach, then there's just more conflation that I think disturbs the ability to look at this as a consistent indicator. And I just feel like that's a challenge we ought to acknowledge as we talk through these options.
I respectfully disagree. If you use last year's 9th grade during 2021 when no other grade counted, and those, as far as what the teachers heard, those scores weren't going to count as far as what the students heard, I don't have to pass this to graduate, and you lump them in to 21, 22 when it all matters, that's what's not comparable.
Let's open it up for additional comments, questions, suggestions.
I agree with Ryan in that the idea of having people telling the people who do the work one thing, and then making this decision from a statistical standpoint is just not fair. I think that if we're going with either one of these options, option 2 would be the only one that would be viable for the teachers and students that actually are doing the work and moving forward. Because I assure you that those letters of intent that's going out, that are going out, is going to be accountability. The decisions is made on accountability by whomever is going to determine on several of those.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. I hear a voice of support for option 2 and some concerns that are expressed. Other comments or suggestions?
Yes, this is Jacob Dykes, principal at Ocean Springs School District, and I kind of disagree with Ryan and agree with the board in regards to we understood it as Dr. Vanderford just discussed. That by all means, we knew that it wasn't going to be as pretty as normal, but it was going to be more student friendly, but the accountability would still be intact.
And the intent and the rationale, and I won't just keep belaboring this point, but that was for the student. I mean, the high stakes for the students. I mean, it was at the 3rd grade level where we had the exemption under the Literacy-Based Promotion Act for students not to be retained in 3rd grade based on the score of that assessment, as well as having the students not being penalized from being able to graduate as high stakes during the pandemic. So the focus was to relieve the student. I mean, it was never a message for districts and schools not to provide the instruction necessary for students to meet or obtain that cut on the assessment. It was just that if the student did not meet it, they would not be penalized by being retained or not be allowed to graduate. So it was never intended to be a message that anyone would be exempt from any accountability for providing instruction.
That that's an unfair statement towards teachers, because it's not that they were choosing not to provide instruction, it's that the context did not allow them to provide quality instruction. Schools were hybrid or virtual, and they didn't have the capability to give that instruction. And so to include those students in this score is not an accurate portrayal of instruction within this school year. And the phrasing of it is that teachers saw the excuse given to students as an excuse to back out of their jobs of instructing kids, when they were leaned into instruction, doing the best they could in a really challenging time. So I think that we need to consider the context of those banked scores and the instruction that was going on, and what that including them is going to show about instruction this year, which has had its challenges as well, but different challenges than the previous year.
I think if we're going to we're going to focus on what, and I see Amanda's comment here in the chat here, like what exactly is being proposed. I really think it's a very new option, and again, Ryan, because I'm trying to reflect on what I think I hear you suggesting, tell me if this is a correct description. But I think what Ryan is proposing is still going to have to involve some skip-year growth and some decisions about how to pull that off technically. So you've got 10th graders who would have taken Algebra 1 in 2022. Everything is hinges on a 22 mathematics performance here. So 10th graders in 22, they would not have a 9th grade score in 21. Or nobody has a score in 20, so you have to go all the way back to 7th graders in 19. For 9th graders in 22, and we do recognize that's the bulk of the examinees, you'd look at their 8th grade scores in 21. So you're using their prior scores from the year prior there. And then for 8th graders in 22, I've just got a big question mark there, because they're not enrolled in a high school at this point. Presumably you I don't know, either leave them out or you connect them to the school that they would feed to, and presumably you'd use their 7th grade scores in 21. But let me pause there and say, Ryan, am I reflecting your suggestion accurately? And I'd love for you in particular to comment on what you're recommending about 8th grade examinees this year.
So yeah, you're exactly right. We still have to pick option 1 or option 2, and I'm not, again, trying to divert the conversation. To me, it's hand in glove. Like you've got to talk about what you're going to do with last year's 9th grade scores in this conversation, because that, honestly, we all know that pretty much is your math categories and your science categories for the most part. So I personally prefer option 2, and then what I would like is if we're going to say vote and pass that, what I was recommending could we add a caveat that we ask the department to discuss whatever that process is. We're not saying officially a file for a 1-year suspension or anything amendment, but ask whatever that process is. Could there be relief for 9th grade banking for this current year, just because of the gaps and the holes that we're in, so that we can make everything comparable? So that way everything is 21, 22 when it comes to what's being calculated as the outcome score. For me, 8th grade students this year, I don't think you would have you wouldn't have to necessarily count them. Maybe we just do 9th grade because we consider 9th grade high school. I know the USD doesn't. I know they start at 10th grade, and that's the whole problem. But since we in Mississippi think of 9th grade as high school, I would think 8th grade you leave there and you will count them in a future year when we get back to things. But possibly we could look at, is that an option? Of course, we would want to say, but we can't do additional high school assessments. So with this if we do this option, would this require an additional high school assessment? If that answer is yes, obviously we can't do this. But that's
It's a
just something
super,
I'm thinking.
super risky ask, Ryan. I mean, I would not call attention to the fact that Mississippi does not have a high school assessment for kids that took Algebra 1 in 8th or 9th grade. And the federal requirement is it has to be a high school math test in grades 10 through 12. So that's where it gets kind of weird. And they don't consider 9th grade. And so if you do go forth with this ask, they might be like, yeah, that's fine. We'll let you do that. But you've just called attention now to you don't have a test for kids to take in high school that's considered a math test for math proficiency. So I would be very careful asking for something like that as a data bridge, especially when we have data and information for almost 92% of kids for high school growth this year. I mean, we're only missing growth for 8% of kids this year if we did option 1. And I know the banking issue is tricky. I think we spent 4 or 5 days on it in previous TAC meetings talking about how to do this and what to do. But I would not go forth with saying, hey, we don't have a high school test, that's why we bank. We don't want to bank this year. I would stay as far away from that as you can.
Yeah, I freely admit that you guys have the conversations with USD. I do not, so you know that process. I'm just bringing something up because to me, that's a more fair data point, more comparable data point than using last year's 9th grade for anything as far as an outcome score. So I will yield to the department. I just bring that up because I'm going to have a major problem presenting to our schools that this is what was agreed upon. And so I don't think it's a data. I think it's wrong on all fronts. That's just my opinion. And I think a lot of the state agrees. So I'm looking at additional options as opposed to that I think are more fair data wise and more common sense, honestly.
Hey, Greg Pazak, Madison County Schools, just comment or two. Really surprised that there's less flexibility since the last time that we met, just from the standpoint of looking at what's been going on since we've returned to the classrooms from Christmas break. It's actually been more difficult on our district in some ways to have instruction over the last month. I mean, finding subs, whether it be for teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, or anything during the Omicron wave has been potentially even more difficult. So I'm just very surprised in the last 6 weeks there's been a shift when, if there was a thought potentially when we met in December that, well, maybe 21, 22, we're back to normal or more normal than we've been in the last couple of years. I will tell you that is not the case in what we're seeing. Also, Christy, you make the comment, 92% of students will have had algebra. And so, 8%, not a lot. And I understand that. But in our district, we have 2 high schools where that's going to be 25 to 30% of theirs. And so for, trying to explain that to our public who have extremely high expectations, it will make a huge difference. So.
Yeah, and Greg, we had looked at that data. I mean, yes, 8.5% across the state, but there are it impacts schools differently based on when they test students, and some of them more than others. So that's kind of why we were considering option 2 to try to get some growth data for those students rather than just excluding them, considering the fact that it impacts schools differently. And we certainly don't want to create a situation where we discourage schools from testing students in algebra at early grades if they're ready to do that. So we've never wanted to do that. So that's why that option 2 is there. Another thing that I'm thinking about here with Ryan's suggestions about and concerns about banking and using data from last year, I think big picture, we're going to see several years of disruptions because of COVID. We're going to see this in our data. We're going to see some, if we continue further with the cuts as they were prior to the pandemic, we're going to see the impact of the pandemic for several years. And it's not just going to be because of banking rules. But, you know, there's going to be other impacts I think we'll see, you know, relative to certain grade bands and cohorts of students as we move forward, and how different grade bands of students have been impacted by the pandemic differently. We've seen that in assessment results already. I think we'll start to see some cohort effects as we move forward past the pandemic that are going to impact schools and districts and accountability measures going forward for several years. And so, I mean, these are some things that I can see we have concerns about in regard to how does that impact schools and districts in regard to rewards and corrective measures for accountability purposes, but just also the reporting side of this is to try to have some comparability across years to study and understand how the impact of the pandemic or how the pandemic has impacted student learning. I think those are going to be important, and in order to use our accountability system to see that impact and that change across years, we're going to need to try to keep those fundamental measures intact. Otherwise, we're going to not see the comparability across years. It's going to be kind of a difficult data lift to try to look at and report, and for the public to see how students were impacted and are progressing as we move out of the pandemic. So just some thoughts that I've had based on our discussion.
I'm glad you said that, Alan, because that brings me to my point. After reading Chris's article that about the DOE the discussion on the 27th and on the 17th of December, I noticed that there is a lot of flexibility. And this is why I stand with Ryan on this, and what you just said, Alan. We have an opportunity here. We, whomever is going to finish this, the accountability, we're having an opportunity. We can, as Paula said earlier, look at what we're doing and review the history of it and see how we did during that time. That's a great classroom project for a university or a doctorate level. But we have an opportunity here to really help the students. And I think, and I believe that we ought to adhere to the leniency that's given in what USDOE said. I think you have to have boots on the ground, and I'm hoping that others would talk to this, because last month has been incredible. Literally trying to getting individuals, because of the virus, the spread of the virus, to actually be in classrooms or to drive buses or to serve food. This is very important. So I think that we need to be not work on the how strict. We need to be a lot more loose, and we even to think, how can we change the thing altogether to assist the students where they are. And since we're going to have problems, Alan, you're exactly right. There are going to be statistical problems throughout this. Why not take this opportunity to assist the students and focus on them, and make sure we use the information that we gathered, Paula, to learn from and put together a better model.
Let me see if I can take stock of where we are, just to let folks maybe that haven't had a chance to weigh in, offer a perspective, and let people continue to reflect on what advice they feel strongest about. We came with two options. As Alan mentioned in response to Greg, the second option really was an attempt for us to think about how to restore some information about 8th grade performance, knowing that that's percentage of students is variable across the state. But all of them are built on skip year. Option 1 is removing 8th grade data because it's not available in 20. Option 2 is replacing it with those students' prior year data. We showed you that we think that's our best opportunity to recover good estimates for that. The third option, I'm going to call it third option, that I think has emerged since we've had this conversation that inspired by Ryan's suggestion, is to remove banking and just draw on 9th and 10th grade scores in 22 and their respective priors, which would come from either 2019 in the case of 10th graders or 2021 in the case of 9th graders. I think in that option, you'd have to remove 8th grade examinees because they're not enrolled in a high school. So I think, I know that Ryan and I may respectfully disagree about what that means to comparability, and I can assure you that that respect is totally mutual, Ryan. But I think that's something we have to just acknowledge is option 3. There's not a good decision about 8th graders there. So none of these are perfect. We realize that we're working in an imperfect environment to try to restore accountability in a way that fulfills federal guidance and honors the principles of the department. But let me just see there. So I've tried to faithfully give you a sketch of where we are with option 1, 2, and what I'm now calling 3. I wonder if anybody has a particular, particularly anybody who hasn't had a chance to weigh in yet, has a point of view they want to share about those options. And we'll keep the space open if there's an option 4 we haven't discovered yet.
It is, Richard. I just want to make sure that I understand about this banking situation, that if we don't bank theoretically, then the stuff that Ryan and everyone else, all the concerns that are being brought up about last year's scores, like how does that play in with the banking? Like, does it actually help solve the situation theoretically, that about what was quote unquote told to the districts and or what the districts perceived as what was meant by that the scores were not going to count, or accountability or whatever? Would that help that?
Yeah, I will say, in all fairness to Ryan, and he's obviously he's a very, very clever thinker, and it's a very thoughtful idea. In all fairness, that does exclusively create outcome data from 22 for mathematics. It does draw on prior data for estimating growth from 21 and from 19, and it does remove 8th graders, at least to the extent I understand it. But Ryan, you should weigh in if you have a response to Richard.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify, like, we have to decide between the options on the screen. I mean, if we're going to have growth, because the USD guidance clearly said you have to identify school improvement, and growth is in our school improvement, as Dr. Domaleski earlier said. So unless we're going to redo how we identify school improvement, you got to have growth. And so that means option 1 or 2. Option 3, to me, I don't call it option 3. I just call it option 2 with an asterisk. It's more just, is it possible? Could we not have banking, but still not have an additional assessment, or not open up a can of worms with the USD, like Dr. Hoban had said? So again, I yield to the department on that. They have the inside conversations. That's their role with the U.S. Department of Ed. I was just bringing that up as a potential option, since their interpretation of the USD guidance is that we can't do the option for banking that I presented at the last meeting. And that their interpretation of the guidance is that we can't have 18, 19 growth points as a safety net with the USD guidance. So because of that, I was looking at some way to make it comparable where last year's 9th grade scores aren't in. But we still have to decide to clarify between option 1 and 2, like that has to be made. And we don't have to make this decision about banking today with that. I just don't want it to get forgotten because I think it's honestly the most important thing we're going to talk about. Okay, so you're suggesting we think about, it's almost like a partial banking if we go with option 2B, what do you call it, 2B or 3? It's probably just nomenclature. But so that would be use outcome scores from 22 for grade 9 and 10, and for 8th grade, pull in their legacy score, which really is a form of banking. And so
And I actually like the way you sort of frame that, which is saying it might be good to just chop this up into two different decisions. Sort of decision one, what do we want to do with 8th graders with missing scores? Do you want to just remove those, or do you want to rely on their last growth score? And then maybe decision two could be, do you want to preserve the traditional banking approach, or do you want to do the trend approach that Ryan has suggested, if it's viable? And again, there are some department complexities that Dr. Havans introduces, and she's not wrong, that we probably have to think about offline, but I'd be fine taking the decision in those two pieces if folks want to do that.
I do want to clarify, if we utilize those legacy scores for the 8th graders, the legacy score would be used in both the proficiency achievement category as well as the growth category. Would be counted in both places, Chris?
That's a good question, and I will admit that we haven't focused on that, but we should hear a recommendation from the task force about that. I think my assumption all along has been that whatever we're doing for growth, we should have the proficiency solution should be hand in glove with it. So that seems like the most reasonable thing to me. But I thank you for bringing that up, because I acknowledge we haven't taken that head on as much as we should.
To me, it looks like option 2 is the more viable option.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so if folks agree with the way I sort of divided those up, let me ask a couple of questions and see what the perspective of the group is. Can we just use hand raise for this? Everybody know how to activate their hand raise feature? You use the hand raise feature. The first question, I'll say it before I ask people to respond. I'm going to ask you, when it comes to 8th grade scores, whether we continue with what I'll call traditional banking, or whether we consider an alternative to banking, such as what Ryan's describing, when it comes to 8th grade scores, are you going to favor using their legacy scores let's just stick with growth for now. I'll deal with proficiency before we finish. For growth, or would you recommend that they be removed from calculation? So the question is, do you support using legacy scores, their last growth score, or would you support them being removed? So would you use your hand raise, or that's fine, thank you, Fred, you can put it in the chat, if you support using legacy? So a show of hands is you support using legacy. If you keep them up, I'm trying to navigate to that screen here. So far I see 11 in support of that. I'll keep that open for just a moment. We want those hands raised if you support using legacy growth scores for 8th graders as opposed to missing. Okay. So thank you. Would everybody put their hands down, their virtual hands down? I want to clear the queue of raised hands so we can see who all is opposed to that. I'm not as facile with Teams as I wish I was. I guess I show 2 people with their hands up. Can they remove their hand raise? One more person to lower their hand. Thank you. So would you now do a virtual hand raise if you support removing those scores from calculation instead of legacy? So you would want your hand raised if you support removing those scores and not using legacy. So far I see 2 hands up. Okay, I'm gonna leave this open a little bit longer. You would want your hand up if you support removing those scores and not using legacy. Okay, so I see 3 in support of that point of view. Okay, thanks. You can lower your hands. Appreciate that. Let's go to the second question. And again, and I think Ryan's has acknowledged this consistently and fairly throughout, so thank you for that, Ryan. But if it's possible, and I think we'll have to do some exploration. Let me frame the question before I ask you to show your hands. Do you support drawing on data from 22? And we've been talking about mathematics, and I don't know if this should include language arts as well. If we did 22, really won't make a big difference, right? Because most students take their ELA tests, their English 2 in 10th grade, and that would be the same. And I don't know, Ryan. Let me kick it over to you on this. If your suggestion for mathematics is one that's viable and supportive, would you also recommend we draw on 9th grade English 2 scores in 22? I assume you would for conceptual consistency.
Yeah, for consistency, I would. Obviously, it's going to have very, very small impact, but it impacts science proficiency as well. And as Greg alluded to earlier, I know we're discussing growth because that's where the holes are, but I agree totally with what you said earlier. Whatever we're going to do for growth, we got to do for proficiency for, obviously common sense purposes. So obviously what I'm discussing here applies to proficiency and growth across all 4 subject areas, just 9th grade students, with the caveat that the department, whoever, has made a decision that it will not cause any discussion or potential issue with another high school math test, because I do not want that to be any sort of issue or someone to get misinterpreted. That I want that to happen, because I do not. So if that's where the department, that's their role, that's where they come in. So if they determine that we can't do that, and that, in conversations, whatever it is, then I just wanted to report back that we at least entertained it.
Okay. So I'm going to frame this. Let me describe how I'm going to frame it, colleagues, before you vote. I want to make sure everybody fully understands what you're voting on. And if you're not ready to vote at any point, I want people to tell me you're not ready and tell me what you want to talk about to be ready. But the thing that we'll vote on is whether you want to use traditional banking. So what's the methods that are currently in place to get scores for growth and proficiency, and which relies on the 10th grade cohort, which we've, I think, explained, but happy to explain again. So traditional banking is going to be the first thing you could vote for. And then the second thing you might want to vote for, if possible, and all the caveats I mentioned, is using current year scores from 22 to the extent practicable. So it's traditional banking versus current year scores from 22. Let me actually pause there. Does everybody understand the difference between those 2 suggestions?
I'm still confused, Chris. Can you please?
Yeah.
I'm not gathering it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're asking, because I think it merits really being super clear about this. So when I call that the current year approach, I'm building on Ryan's suggestion. And what that would mean is, for mathematics, students who took Algebra 1 in 10th grade in 22 this year, their growth score is going to be calculated on that test, as it would in any situation. Students who took Algebra 1 as a 9th grader this year, now ordinarily they wouldn't be counted in the calculation, but they would be under this proposal, and we would look back at their further scores in 21 as the prior. And then I think we already talked about 8th graders, so let's leave that alone. So it's just saying that instead of traditional banking, where we look at scores for 10th graders whenever they took them, we're going to look for scores wherever we find them in 2022. And we're going to use the best prior we have to calculate growth for that. And again, as Ryan and Greg and others have reminded us to remember, that likely means that that's what we'll do for proficiency, but I'll talk about that separately just to make sure we don't look past it before we finish. So do you draw scores from 22 for 9th and 10th graders Or do you keep your 10th grade cohort intact? That's your traditional approach, and look at their scores wherever they're banked.
Yes, and I want to, instead of 2021 ninth graders, with this proposal, you are not using the 2021 ninth graders, option 2 that you just presented.
Right. Thanks for clarifying that.
Just to ask another clarifying question. I know we're making decisions for this year, but for next year, what would that look like? Would we count the same cohort of students, our ninth grade currently, again? And then would that be a benefit for some districts that test more ninth graders rather than 10th graders?
Yeah, Dr. Dykes, thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a fantastic question. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think I've squirmed a little on this comparability question, because I think downstream it introduces some complications that don't easily go away. I think that's a decision. Now, I think my assumption has been that because the federal department seems fairly open to 1 year fixes, that we're talking about a 1 year solution. But you're right, if we do this for 1 year and we go back to traditional methods next year, then you're going to have some students that are going to have multiple instances in the data file. So really grateful that you brought that up. That's an important piece of information.
Yes, that's a great point. It's what I've been, I would love if we could, if the USD, we got a USD department, if they would agree that we don't have to have banking going forward, it would make things so much easier and make sense. However, so all I'm asking is the department to report back, like, okay, they would allow this, but this would be a gap next year. So now we would have to decide about next year. They would allow this going forward. We can't even entertain that. We can't even ask them. I just want, some information, if you will. That's all I'm asking for here.
But because I don't know the next time we're going to meet, and I know the department has to put together their addendum quickly, I'd love to get, if we do pursue that, and if it clears the Mississippi department's approval and federal approval, it'd be good to know where the task force stands, is all I want to do. So I'm going to say it one more time. Thanks for everybody for being patient. I think clarity is super important here. I'm going to ask you in a moment to raise your hand if you support traditional banking or just using scores from 22. So we'll call it that current year approach for 1 year. And I think we've acknowledged the complications of each. So I'll stop there. But anybody else want to ask for clarity before we ask for hand raises? Okay, why don't we start with traditional banking? So please raise your hand if you suggest we stick with traditional banking. Raise your hand if you suggest we stick with the traditional banking approach. Okay, I see 3. You can lower your hands. Make sure the queue is cleared. You still have your hand up if you kindly lower it. If you support the current year, using current year scores, if approved, please raise your hand virtually. Okay. Oh, I was going to say, I think we're done. Let's see now, 11. Okay. All right, thanks. You can lower your hands. So here's what I'm taking from this, and I'll talk about proficiency, then we'll take a break. I'm taking from this conversation that whatever we do, the task force supports using legacy performance for 8th graders, so we have some estimate of 8th grade performance. The accountability task force supports pursuing the viability of a current year approach as a departure from banking for this year. If it can be, if it meets state and federal approval, and acknowledging that there may be some complications that that hinder that. But if those complications can be addressed, the task force prefers that approach. So we'll get clarity on it, and we'll understand where the majority of the task force is as we do that. So the last thing I just want to say, I really think we've sort of by default landed in a position with proficiency, but let me say where that is and invite people to comment on it if you disagree with that. So I think wherever you get your outcome score for growth is where you get your proficiency score. So I think that's the concept that is sort of implied by our decisions, but if people want to push back on that, I want to give you space to do that. So what that would mean, obviously, is if traditional banking is implemented, that whether that we'll just stick with math for a moment. We use the students' 10th grade score in 2022 for proficiency. We'd use their 9th grade score in 2021 for proficiency, and presumably we'd use their legacy math score in 2019 for proficiency, if we sort of apply conceptually all the advice that the task force has given us here. And if we go with what I call the current year approach, then we would draw on proficiency from all high school Algebra 1 taken in 2022, and presumably import legacy for 8th graders. Again, I know it's complicated. That's a partial banking, which is why I think there's a big asterisk next to this regarding its liability. But that's kind of where I think we'd land with proficiency. So I see a few nods as I described that. But let me hear from the task force if there's any sort of objections to the way that I described how we would think about proficiency.
The only way I think about this for proficiency is we're not going to have a math test in high school for a lot of kids. That's what the proficiency concern is going to be. So I'm going to have a hard time with this vote because I want all students to count in proficiency. But if we do it for math and we do an Algebra 1 in 8th grade or in 9th grade as a proficiency, the USDE is going to say you don't have a high school math test for these kids and you have to implement a new high school math test. So I find this very challenging to have a vote on.
I think it's well said, Kristen.
I think this is a living attempt, and I like the word pursue or pursuing that you used earlier. And as we move forward, we will look at the situations that we have, and we'll keep making decisions. I just honestly believe that if our focus keep our focus on what is actually going on in the classroom, that we'll make the best decisions.
Just Jacob Dykes again, just to clarify, if we don't have a growth calculation, we're going to use what the committee is pursuing is to possibly utilize legacy scores. But to be comparable to that, districts may also choose to use a legacy proficiency. Is that what was proposed? Because that,
yeah, this is why I call this a partial banking approach. And I don't know, actually, the more I think about it, the more skeptical I am that it's going to get federal approval. So for proficiency, there's only a couple ways you can do this. You can say, okay, we'll do 10th graders with Algebra 1 scores in 22, 9th graders with Algebra 1 scores in 22. And then if you're committed to getting 8th grade scores in there, then you'd have to look at your banked 8th grade scores for 10th graders. And wait a minute, there are no scores in that bank. So you'd have to look at their last proficiency score. You have to look at your 10th graders, presumably, and call on their last proficiency score, which would be 7th grade. I don't see a world where a 7th grade score gets approved for a high school measure. And it may be that option two suffers the same fate, when it comes to growth. But, I think we're willing to explore all options in the interest of being fair and respectful to everybody. So yeah, and Christy, I actually wasn't going to take this to a vote because I'm not even really sure what to vote on here. I was what I was suggesting to the group is that whether traditional banking survives, I think we know what happens to proficiency there, or whether some current year approach can be approved, which we'll pursue it. I'm skeptical. Then we'll have to see what's allowable, and I think we kind of know the answer to that question. I think it would be only 9th and 10th grade scores. But we'll pursue it and we'll see what's permissible. Yeah, I don't really know what to vote on here. And if we can have another meeting, if we can vet some of these ideas and have another meeting and talk to you guys again before the department has to do the addendum. I don't want to speak for the department here. They control those decisions. Then I think, that'd be great. But if not, as you saw from my conversation, I just wanted to get as much of a sense for where the task force is as we explore these options.
So, Chris, can I just make a point of personal privilege? So, as we're debating all these things, I always bring it back to students and what Mississippi has accomplished, and I will remind us every meeting of what Mississippi has accomplished. Since prior to implementing this accountability system, Mississippi has moved from 50th in the nation to the national average. It's remarkable improvement in 8 years. I brag about the state of Mississippi and everything you all do every single day, and the fact that we can measure it and compare it and demonstrate it, and it shows up in our NAEP results is amazing. So just as we're thinking through this, making sure that we're making decisions that are consistent in the best decision for students and student outcomes, not just how to get more points for accountability systems. The USDE, when they were originally putting out this guidance, was as a data bridge because not everybody did as good of a job of getting students to participate in their state assessments as Mississippi did last year. So just remember how much work has already gone into this and how much progress has already been made in Mississippi, and hoping that's going to be continuing without us compromising on expectations and rigor for kids.
Thanks, Kristen. Really important to remember that.
If I understand the way ESSA is written, it gives out to the local as much as possible to the local educational agency, in this case MDE or Kemper County, where I am. I think that the reason why I really want us to really think hard about presenting ideas like what Ryan is saying, because that's what it does. It's okay that we're better than Alabama or whomever, and that's fine. But the thing is that what's really important is, are we better for the students that we're serving every day? Are we reaching out to those students, and are we doing what we can to help them? I think that we need to read, or my reading or my understanding of the document is that we need to focus on the individuality of what we're doing and the personality of what we're doing from the location that we are. And this committee, being representative of Mississippi, well representative of Mississippi, we should be able to do that.
Thanks.
Good morning. This is Kenneth Pulley, Greenwood, LaFleur Consolidated School District. I agree with Ryan and Fred. I agree with Krista. We have made some great strides in our state. But this is a different time. COVID-19 has affected all of us greatly, and it has impacted and continues to impact teaching and learning every day. I heard someone mention how tough it is to ensure that classroom instruction continues in spite of teacher absences due to COVID exposure. And so we've had some tough times, even just coming from the Christmas break, holidays. And so while the data is important to be sure that we would love Mississippi to remain number one, across the nation. However, I think we should make the decisions that's in the best interest of our students and teachers who are in there every day. We as administrators are the ones who we monitor this each day. We work with our teachers and our students, but the rubber meets the road in that classroom where they are. And I think we should continue to be mindful of this as we make decisions for what accountability looks like. I heard Ryan mention it is going to be tough. It's February. The testing window opens again very soon. And so it's going to be tough in speaking with teachers and then sharing with community that, hey, we're going to, of course, accountability is alive and well. We're going to have to continue to teach and learn. But last year, there may have been, even though it was not directly communicated that, accountability is not going away. But we were faced with many challenges that kind of just abruptly showed up, and teachers had to adjust accordingly. Families had to adjust accordingly. And with that said, I think that we should definitely consider those options carefully. And I most certainly agree with option 2B as we discussed.
I think one of the things we need to be mindful of too is that and I do apologize, I'm driving, so I don't have my camera on, but we need to, and I work in a Delta district as well. We just need to be mindful that our children are going to be going out into the world, into the workforce, and they're not just going to be up against students or individuals in Mississippi. They're going to be moving. Our kids are not staying in the locations where we are. So we have to be mindful of that, looking at the big picture. I know we're looking at the right now, and as a person, the director of accountability, I want to look at the right now as well, but we're also thinking about the students as they move forward. So we need to be thinking about that in the same instance and making decisions, not so much for the right now, but as we move forward. So just my little 2 cents there.
Great. Thank you, colleagues. All important and appreciated comments. I'm going to invite us to wrap up this part of the meeting. We're actually right at time. Very quickly, this is the chief takeaways that I'm hearing. We will be looking to implement a skip year growth methodology to deal with this accountability transition, as we've covered in pretty good detail the last couple of meetings. We think there's every reason to believe that that's going to be approved. We will explore using legacy performance of 8th graders where those data are missing. There's probably a little less certainty about whether that can be approved, but we've heard the task force say that that's something that you support. And we will explore the plausibility of suspending banking for a year. But we've acknowledged, and I think even the people that have voiced support for it have been quick to acknowledge there are some real challenges with that may make that prohibitive, but we will look into it to honor the guidance of the task force and provide some feedback based on what we hear there. And that obviously, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, this is a recommendation to the department, and there are federal considerations. So if it sounds like I'm trying to manage expectations, it's because I am. I think there's some real challenges here that I just don't want to be coy about that. Great, but I'm grateful for all your thoughtful feedback. There's not a doubt in my mind that everybody on this task force is thinking deeply and trying hard to solve difficult problems and to do so in a way that is putting students first, and I appreciate all of you for that. Let's take a break. It's right at 9:50, so why don't we come back at 10:05? So we will break until 10:05. We'll keep the connection going, and we'll just mute and turn off cameras for a few minutes. We'll give folks just maybe another minute to get settled in, but we hope you have a chance to step away and get a little break. I know it's a lot this morning. And Alan, if you don't mind, when we start back here in just a moment, let's go ahead and just start with slide 19, please. Okay, I've got, excuse me, about 6 minutes after, so hopefully, again, you were able to get a break and been able to return. Our next topic and our final topic for today before we close with an opportunity to hear from everybody is about ESSA classification. So I'm sorry to report the questions don't get any easier, but no less important. This is a topic that we've had a number of huddles to really think through, and we believe we've identified a solution that we think is very promising, and we'd like to vet it with Accountability Task Force and get your advice and feedback. So next slide, please. So the two questions that we propose to discuss with the task force today are these. What's the recommended timeline for identification and exit? And again, we have a proposal for that. What does the task force think about potentially modifying the criteria for identification or exit? And also we'll speak to that in a little more detail here in just a moment. Next slide. Not unlike our previous topic, we thought we'd start with a few what we're calling non-negotiables. We want people to see where the guardrails are. The department must classify schools as CSI, ATSI, and TSI. So those, we don't have an option to skip doing that. And classification decisions must be based on data in 21-22. I think I mentioned that in our previous topic, and it applies here as well. So just kind of carrying over designations exclusively is not an option that is available by federal guidance. And sort of a corollary to that is that if any school is removed from classification, they have to satisfy approved exit criteria. So what that implies is that in any approach where we say we're kind of going to erase what was done in the past and start fresh with something new, technically doesn't meet federal guidance. And this is something that we've pursued with them because we have to be able to show that any school that was in a classification category has exited, particularly for CSI, ATSI. And then finally, we want to say that the state remains committed to the long-term goal of 70% proficiency. So we want to keep that in mind as we have these conversations as well. Next slide. So we found it helpful as we've done our internal planning and conversations to try to map out the timeline here, because this can be kind of hard to keep track of sometimes. So let me share with you how one way that we're thinking about it to show you what the questions are that we need to address. So let's start with what we'll call the original timeline. So this is what the world was supposed to look like before all the COVID disruptions. So if you go back to the state's original plan for accountability that was approved, there were identifications made in school year 17-18 and for CSI. And CSI status was thought to be a 3-year status, so it would be made on 3-year cycles. And so you see what those years were thought to be. So year 1 and school year 19, year 2 and school year 20, and year 3 and school year 21. And then if you go down to the next row, in school year 21, that would be the next identification year. And at that time, schools would either exit or there would be more rigorous interventions to support those schools. There'd also be potentially new schools identified in the CSI at that time. So that's the timeline before things got disrupted. So let's go to the next slide. And I thought what I'd do is sort of describe what you're going to see and then show it to you. I think that might be the clearest way to do it. What we're proposing to deal with the disruptions, because as you know, we didn't have accountability in school year 20, and there was testing, but didn't have accountability in the traditional way in 21. That we would implement what we're going to call transitional CSI classifications based on data this year as required by law. That classification could be based on modified criteria. I'll say more about that in just a moment. And that schools classified in the fall of 22 based on data from this academic year 22, would be re-examined after 1 year, which we believe is permissible by law. And the traditional 3-year cycle would restart in the fall of 23 based on data from 22-23. And if that's kind of hard to keep track of, you're not alone. It's so let me show it to you graphically to help you see what we're talking about here. So this is what I'm calling the proposed COVID impacted timeline. So back to the original identification, which was made in 17-18, 18-19 was the first year of CSI. You see the two grayed out boxes show that we had an accountability pause for 19 and 20. And in fact, I don't even really know what to call school year 21-22, the one we're in now, in terms of like what the clock says about what year of CSI that is. I think in one sense you could call that year 3, you could call it year 4, you could call it year 2. I could probably imagine a different rationale for calling it different things, but we're proposing that let's just call it the terminal year, that schools inherited, schools that were previously identified as CSI are still CSI now. And the important question is, what do we do moving forward? So what we're proposing is that using data from this year as required by law, if you want to shift now to the bottom row, that this is the identification year, and that those schools that have been in that status in the top row are going to exit their exit, or we're going to have classifications of new CSI schools that we're going to call transitional CSI. Why are we calling it transitional? Because we're thinking of that as a 1-year thing. So again, schools that qualify to exit will exit. Schools that need to enter will enter. But when they enter, they're just going to enter for 1 year, we're proposing. So those are the two sort of red boxes. And then what happens the next year? Well, we'll call that a traditional identification year. So that the 22-23 year, which will lead to schools that could exit classification as CSI, even if they're only in there for 1 year, and we'll identify schools that should be CSI based on the identification rules, and a new 3-year cycle would begin. The intent of this is to put things back on a cycle, on a 3-year cycle that starts in fall of 23. So that's the intent. Partially because we think we'll have better accountability data to inform that. We'll be done with the skip year growth methodology, and hopefully the complications that we're wrestling with now will largely be dealt with. And so that new 3-year cycle will begin, but those two red cells show that in the meantime, we will be fulfilling federal law by exiting by approved criteria and identifying by statutory requirements. I know there's going to be questions, but let me just keep pressing on, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So the next slide, please. So ATSI is another element that we need to think about. So ATSI, additional targeted supports and improvement schools, are those that have a low performing group, a group that's in the bottom 5% based on the all students group for all Title I-A schools. And the original ESSA plan calls for 3 consecutive years for ATSI to result in CSI. So this is that cumulative ATSI classification issue that Mississippi and many states that I know about are dealing with. And our proposal is to defer cumulative ATSI classification into CSI to the fall of 23 based on the school year 22-23 data. And the purpose of that would be to sync the cumulative ATSI and CSI identification cycle. So the idea would be if schools are ATSI this year, based on academic year 21-22, and have 3 consecutive years of ATSI for whatever the last 3 years of intact accountability are, then they would graduate in the fall of 23 into CSI. But we wouldn't make a CSI impact with this year's accountability. What we're saying is we're going to defer that and do that next year. And we think this has the attractive quality of putting CSI and ATSI kind of back on a similar cycle. And in every case, pardon me, in every case, it relies on an accountability system that we think is more intact than the system that we're dealing with this year to try to manage the missing data problems that we've been talking about for the last 2 meetings. Next slide. So let's linger a moment on classification criteria, because we think this is actually the main decision point. Obviously, everything I'm talking about is up for discussion, which is why we're bringing it to you. But the current identification rules are grade rate less than 67%. That's non-negotiable. That stays in place. Score in the bottom 5% of Title I-A schools, also staying, is non-negotiable. And then I just mentioned the ATSI with 3 consecutive years of subgroup performance in the bottom 5%. And I think I mentioned what we propose to do with that. We propose to deal with that decision after the 22-23 academic year. And right now, the exit criteria is sort of somewhat kind of what gets you in, gets you out. So if you score above the bottom 5%, you exit. But you have to do one additional thing. You have to increase a letter grade or over the midpoint of a letter grade. So there is a progress element to exiting. So an example of the midpoint is that a school in the bottom half of F goes to the top half of X. So you either have to move over move up a letter grade, or move at least kind of like half the distance to the next letter grade. Next slide, please. So we think one modification to particularly the exit criteria that's worth thinking about together is for what we're calling the transitional year that starts in fall 22. That's the year that's informed by data from 21-22, that we would essentially propose to remove that "and" part of the exit criteria. So remove the requirement that not only do you have to be identified above the bottom 5%, but you also have to increase a letter grade or progress over the midpoint. So take the progress part out of the exit. And again, that's partially inspired by the fact that, as this group knows better than just about anybody, there are some complications in comparing accountability across years. We think progress would be a very difficult criterion to achieve. And we think that the most important thing is to identify a manageable group of schools that are in the bottom 5% that most urgently need support, as opposed to having that category potentially balloon to a place where it's not going to be feasible to support those schools. And then, as I mentioned, we restore the traditional exit and identification criteria starting when the full cycle gets restored back to its intact characteristics. So that "and" exit criterion, the progress part, would come back back when the traditional 3-year cycle starts in the fall of 23. Next slide. So that's it. That's the content we had. You see that we've tried to think through this and bring you a proposal that we think is reasonable in dealing with the challenges of disrupted accountability, and it's characterized by sort of what I'll call a 1-year transitional cycle for exit identification, followed by a new 3-year cycle where we restore the timelines and the criteria and the way they're currently in the plan. We don't know for sure. We've done enough close reading of the guidance, and we've had some communication with the feds about this, if this will be approved, but we feel optimistic that it honors both the letter and the spirit of the law and the department's priorities. So I'll stop there. And I don't know unless anybody from the department has any comments they'd like to make about this. I think we open it up for your reactions and comments.
Dr. Robinson, do you have anything that you open with?
So good morning, Dr. Vanderford. No, I think I'd rather just kind of hear what the TAC is going to bring forward. I think Chris did a great job at kind of laying out where we are.
All right, thank you. All I'm going to have to exit for another meeting, and I'll rejoin just as soon as my next meeting is over.
Great. So I welcome feedback and comments.
Chris, I think this is the very essence of what we should be doing. It looks as if that you were looking for what the students have done. You're going to take that in consideration and give the opportunity for them, or ask for an opportunity for a restart, which is what it should be done because it was interrupted. But I personally like the way that you were. It seems as if that you were digging deeper into where the students' performance is, and based on that, keeping and allowing them to receive that assistance as needed. So I like it.
Thanks for that feedback.
I would concur with that.
I agree. Those are fine proposals for CSI and ATSI as it relates to CSI, in my opinion. What about identifying ATSI? Are we using 18, 19, and 22 for the 3-year average? That's, to me, the bigger discussion.
Yeah. So you mean identifying ATSI, the cumulative effects of ATSI, or just any like ATSI for 21, 22?
Yeah, I understood the guidance is saying you had to identify ATSI. So for instance, like our schools are in ATSI because it's been carried over, to try to get out of ATSI with the 3-year average. Will it be 2018, 2019, and 2022 that makes up the 3-year average?
Yeah, I don't think we explicitly talked about that when we sketched this out, but that, I mean, I will say straight away, that seems reasonable to me. Those are the last 3 years of any kind of accountability. So I don't know what else I could say about that. I don't know, Dr. Robinson, do you have any comments about that?
I think that was part of the amendment, part of the option or the assumption in the amendment is that we would exclude those 2 years in this slide that are gray. Dr. Robertson, is that right?
So yes, and I apologize. I'm having the most trouble trying to find my mute button. But yes, I think part of the feedback or some of the guidance speaks to us being able to skip those 2 years in the middle that are impacted by COVID. So we would look at those years that are that we have the data for. So getting with Deborah and her team and just making sure that we are looking at what specific years would be counted in that 3-year average is something that we do need to kind of make sure we are able to be clear on. I think that's important for you. I think that was Ryan that asked that question.
Good question. Any other comments or feedback?
And just to follow up, can schools, based off those 3 years, be added into ATSI this year after the 21-22 data?
I'll take a crack at that, and others can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have the option to skip doing ATSI. So the idea would be that yes, you can be classified newly as ATSI if you meet that subgroup, any one subgroup below 5%. But that's kind of why we were talking about deferring the cumulative impact for another year. Other comments or questions? I'm feeling a sense of accomplishment that we brought an idea that looks like it's generally well received, and we'll do our best to represent that in our communications with the feds. But all the sort of caveats we had in the previous conversation about we don't know until we know, but we wanted to hear from this task force as we put together materials for them to respond to.
Anything that we bring to DOE, especially with the way they wrote their responses, it seems as if they want us to bring something. I think that I really, really, really want, and I will continue to harp on the idea of the LEA should be bringing our own ideas. Because this is not Washington D.C. and so I really like the way that your team approached this, Chris. I'm just interested. And of course, that horse has been ridden for a while. I'm just interested in why we wouldn't consider this even for growth as well.
Say more about that, about what we wouldn't consider for growth. You mean just
absolutely. I'm happy to take the box, not go outside the box, but to literally kick it completely out the way. Basically, going through the amendment process, we literally amend what we're doing with accountability to work for the students. And have it ask for I couldn't remember, I believe it was the previous slide where you had like 2 years in which there were no data that was brought in. You literally ask and start over with 21-22 and start from there and actually put in the work of an accountability model that worked for students in Mississippi. I'm not afraid. Of course, I hadn't been to Washington lately. But I'm not afraid to actually develop an idea that's better for the students of Mississippi, as opposed to wrestling with an idea that is not very equitable and not like, for instance, this idea. This is fantastic because what you're doing is that you're giving the schools an opportunity to show what they've done, and if they've done what they was tasked to do, then they're exiting. Okay, I think that we should consider that. If they're going to allow us to bring ideas, I think we ought to bring the ideas, consider the students in all of the ideas that we move forward with.
I appreciate your perspective, sir. And I will say, I don't see a hesitancy from the department to represent novel ideas when the time, when the occasion calls for it. And it's a balance. I think there's always an appetite to think innovative about what we can do for accountability, but at the same time, be realistic about what where those guardrails are, so that the department can make sure it stays in good standing to preserve their Title I funding. So I totally understand, and I don't in any way want to discourage anybody from the task force to push on ideas that might be long-term changes to the model, if that's, if we have a strong rationale for it. And I think what you're suggesting is like the previous conversation of growth that called into question the persistence of banking as an example of what it sounds like you're referring to. But I appreciate that perspective. Thank you, sir. Yeah, we don't have to stay on this topic longer than is reasonable. If we feel like we've got a proposal that passes the sniff test pretty quickly, then I think we can document that in our meeting notes, and we can move to the last part of the meeting where we do a round robin of all the members. I really value that part. I love to listen to things that you have to say and guidance for future directions. So is there anything else? I'll just sort of one more invitation before we transition to our wrap-up session. Fantastic, thank you. I really appreciate that. And by the way, I want to be quick to say that if there were things about that last idea that you liked and thought were well thought out, the credit goes to the department, to Dr. Robinson and Mr. Burrow and that team. So they're the folks that deserve credit. So they're a fantastic team. Okay, let's. I think what I'll do is just go. I'll use the same list of task force members, and I'll just call your name, and I will welcome you to provide whatever closing remarks that you would like to. We always like to listen for priorities for future meetings. So if there are things that you say, hey, can we visit this or revisit or take up this topic at a future meeting, we'd love to hear your ideas for that. Any other general comment about your perspective of accountability or this meeting, we're happy to hear. So we'll start with Karen Howard.
I do appreciate the recommendations you made for the ESSA classifications. And I thank you for your patience in listening to everyone's proposals regarding the growth model. I have still a little question about the legacy performance. We keep saying the legacy performance for 8th graders. So what does that mean? I need a clarification on that one more time. I'm writing it down. So
it just simply refers to if we don't have growth or possibly proficiency data for 8th graders, do we look at the last time we had growth data and we use that instead?
So you mean an 8th grader that is currently a high school student? Is that what you mean?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you've got a 10th grader and we're trying to use that 10th grader's 8th grade algebra score because of the way that banking is designed, and that 8th grader doesn't have an algebra score, then let's look and find the most recent performance that we can for that student and use it instead.
Okay, and so when we meet again, we'll have an answer to the question of whether we will use 9th graders' current year algebra score.
I do anticipate we'll be able to wrap up whether we're using traditional banking or some modification of that, and we'll also be able to address what we're doing with 8th grade scores for proficiency and growth.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet. Kimmy Strain, she may not be here. Is Kimmy here? Shalandia Washington. Any comments from Shalandia Washington? Oh, you know what? Yeah, you might be on mute, ma'am.
Sorry.
Okay.
I actually just have a quick question, and it may need to go to our next meeting. But as far as the formula for how the EL students are factored into the accountability model, is that expected to change, or, you know, the points that we get for our EL population is kind of something I had a question about. So that may need to go for our next meeting.
I'll just make a note. Did anybody have an immediate response? But I was going to make a note to take that up at a future meeting.
We don't anticipate an impact to calculating EL points this year because we should have ELPT data for last year and this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else, Ms. Washington?
No.
All right.
I've enjoyed the spirited discussion today.
I love that word. That's a good word to use. It had a good spirit of discussion. That's what it should be. Anthony Goins?
Yes, first of all, thank you for letting me participate and be a part of listening to discussions that have been taking place today. First of all, I am in agreement with the CSI and ATSI proposal. I think that's great moving forward. As far as the growth model, said last time, still at this time, I'm a big advocate at this point. I don't think the results from 2020-2021 scores should be used moving forward. I'm also a proponent of, I know it's only 8.5% of students that's taking assessments as 8th graders, but in some school districts, 8.5% as pertains to the state, it turns into 25 to 30%. And so I don't think we just disregard saying, okay, those kids did not exist. Not afraid of accountability, in favor of accountability, but at the same time, I think accountability is also used as an evaluation of performance for school districts and students and teachers within the schools. And so I don't think we just need to go ahead and just say that those kids did not exist. If we really believe that attendance matters, if we really believe teaching and learning matters inside the school, we just cannot disregard about what took place last year, what's currently taking place. And so, like I said, I'm not afraid of accountability, but I think all of these be taken into consideration and moving forward and how that does impact Mississippi schools and school districts.
Thank you for your feedback, sir. Ryan Kirkendall?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Hickman. He's repeatedly stated that the USD guidance was very clear that, hey, we want y'all to only focus on school improvement, identify the mandate assessments, and focus on those schools that need improvement and do whatever you need to do to make that happen. I mean, that was pretty much, to me, the summary of the document. The FAQ B2 says an SEA could also propose to replace school letter grades with a series of business or decision rules or filters that provide greater weight to academic indicators and result in identification of schools for support and improvement. So they've never mandated we have letter grades, and they would let us change our ESSA plans to not have letter grades this year. I know we would also need state legislation permission because that's the state law, but I am in favor of no letter grades this year due to the impact of what happened in August and September, what we're dealing with now, which several people have talked about. You have to do things in opposite of what's good for instruction right now. You have to choose that over instruction, and the time is still being missed by staff and students at the highest level it ever has. So I think we do what the USD has asked us to do, and we identify the schools for improvement, and then that's it. That's my opinion. But I want to thank you guys for listening, and thank you for giving us the opportunity. Spirited debate is the right word. Those of you that know me know I am going to give where I stand, and I'm probably going to give it with strong opinion, but please know I do it respectfully, and I appreciate everyone's opinion on this task force, and I just thank you for letting me be included.
Really always appreciate your perspective, Brian. Thanks so much for everything. Christy.
Thank you, Chris. You always do a really good job facilitating these meetings, so really appreciate that. Appreciate that you let everyone have opportunity to voice opinions, and have the dialogue go along. Ryan, yes, agree, has strong convictions as well. I know we both have the best interest of students in mind. We just don't always approach it in the same way. I'm excited to see that Mississippi has maintained the progress that they have and think that it's going to continue through COVID years. I'm optimistic that student achievement is going to continue to go up just with the efforts that have been made with in-person schooling and instruction. So just want to keep seeing the progress in Mississippi. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Christy. Thanks for all your great contributions. Dr. Hickman?
I'm grateful for the opportunity, as everyone else has stated. I want to also speak on school improvement in that I believe that as I said before, building a component for SEL will allow us to get provide an accountability model that will show improvement. Unless I'm wrong, I don't think there's an SEL department at MDE. Mr. Burrow, if you're needing some help with actually coming up with a proposal for that, I'm happy to assist with that because I've been working with that for this for over 20 years. It's very, very important that this committee thinks about social emotional learning as we go forward, and as a one of the ideas that we need to bring to SBE to better serve our students here in Mississippi. Thank all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Hickman. I appreciate your contributions very much. Greg Pazik?
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to share, and also appreciate y'all's willingness to listen. It does seem like there's a common goal in that we do want to, in the short term and in the long term, be able to have a system that measures the performance of our students and gives a reliable, valid picture to the public of the great improvements that have been made and are going to continue to be made in Mississippi. And I will just share with you, again, like Anthony was mentioning earlier about those Algebra 1 middle school students, and also for our district as well, did not mention this earlier, we have in a couple of those same high schools up to a quarter of our students taking Biology 1 in the 8th grade as well. And so, just one of the things to consider, if those students are not included in the performance of our schools, do not meet the expectations of our public, and reflect traditionally the great work that's going on. One of the issues Mississippi may not only face in Madison County, but also across the state is, as has been mentioned, due to the impact of COVID, is you may have teachers not coming back who, the teachers are where the rubber meets the road, and that's the folks who are making these great strides on NAEP results. And also in our area, if some of these students too, who take advanced classes in middle school, if they're not counting the performance of our schools that are reflected with them, these are also school students that have options on their educational future and where they participate and gather their education. They may not be included in public education as well. So just kind of think about, as we in the short term and long term, the impact of the decisions we're making on the teachers and then also the students, and how that could hurt us then as far as our performance in the future.
So much, Greg. I appreciate that. I'm going to skip the department folks and have them go last, and let them have the last word on anything they want to offer to the group. Superintendent Smith. Is Jay Smith with us? Possible he had to step away. Richard Ballico?
Yes, I got three things. In my opinion, I got a long-term view and then a view specific to my district. But I think that we need to be careful, in my opinion, to not disrupt the system whenever it can be avoided, because and I could be wrong about this, but in 2026 the assessment contracts will be up, and The rules say that we have to, if the assessment changes, we have to look at the accountability system. So 2026 might be a pretty big year, maybe not. But until then, we're 4 years away from it. If we try to make any significant changes now, that could have, reverberating effects for 2026. The other thing, I'm just two things I'm just wondering sometimes, with some of these decisions that we talk about, some of these options we talk about, just to peer into some of the subgroup data. I know that creates more work, but just see what it looks like. My school district is majority African American. So what does these decisions look like with regards to make my students? The assumption is that everything's going to be okay, but what if it's not? What if some of these decisions disadvantage certain populations and certain districts? So just want to bring that out, just to peer into every now and then. I know that it's unrealistic to peer into that every single time, because then that's just a lot of graphs, a lot of charts to look at, and we could get conflated with our decisions. And then the other thing is, I can do this, but every now and then, I think it might be kind of beneficial to at least look at what some of the other states are doing with some of these decisions. Maybe to look at, states similar to what Mississippi's doing, and not that we have to copy them or, but it's just they may have some kind of outside the box idea that we haven't considered, or maybe they're getting away with something that maybe we can get away with as well. That's all in alignment with the legislature, with State Department policy, and maybe we may draw from that and think of a good idea from that. So thank you all for letting me voice my opinions about all three of those things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your contributions. Jacob Dykes.
Yes, I feel like I kind of spoke up throughout the presentation, so I don't really have much to say. I appreciate everybody giving me the opportunity to be here and participate in these conversations. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir. I think Fina Hintz is not here, but I'll pause a moment to see if that's right. Fina? Amanda Garcia?
My comments at this point are more on topics going forward. I would like for us to talk about the letter grades. I mentioned that last time, and that's still something I would like for us to consider. And also something that stands out to me from this discussion has been the challenge of fitting middle school into a high school model and the repercussions of that. So as we talk about accountability going forward, I would like for that to be a topic of conversation of, if that is the biggest challenge, why are we manipulating the model for something that is not really intended to be part of the model? And what are some ways to make an assessment of high school truly an assessment of high school math going forward? That's probably an unpopular topic of conversation, but I think it's one that would best serve students and teachers if we are doing a high school assessment.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate your contributions. Matt Thompson.
Also, I don't have much to say different, just kind of echoing kind of what Amanda just said and what Ryan said earlier about the letter grades. That is, whatever we decide and whatever happens with all this high school growth and proficiency, it's going to affect things greatly, but we need to be talking about what the effects are going to be on the letter grades and whether or not that's reasonable to continue with, or I also don't want to take anything away from any schools or districts that make improvements this year. Take that into consideration as well. I'm sure that's going to be topics we talk about in the future, but I just want to make sure that that was brought up.
Thanks so much, sir. Appreciate that very, very much. Crystal Bates. Crystal Bates. Possibly had to step away. Tracy Cameron.
Yes, I just wanted to didn't have much to say, but wanted to reiterate that we need to be mindful that we're in the here and now. We have the COVID situation. I am in a district that, we were virtual for the majority of the year last year. We were virtual this year for a portion of the time, but we're looking at our children's future. So as we're talking about the accountability, and I know, how the accountability works as far as districts are concerned, and I know that districts are concerned, we're concerned, but our ultimate goal is to ensure that our children are able to compete in a global society. So whatever that looks like, as we move forward, I would like to discuss the letter grades more. I would like to see, what our state is going to do as it relates to the growth. With the banking, we may need to look at that. I know I've gone to several conferences where it talked about and I think that's what Amanda was alluding to. I'm not sure, but with the 8th graders taking Algebra 1, what is the benefit of that? Other than it being something that maybe the community would like, but it could put us in a big deficit as to why we may be having this lengthy discussion about it. So just some things that we've learned from this time that we may need to consider for the future, and really looking at, where we are and what we need to look to, and just remembering that the children are the center of it. So that's
so much, Tracy. Really appreciate those words. Let me check in with the department as we close. Deborah, do you have any comments?
No, I don't have any comments to add. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks for all the great work you do to support these discussions. Dr. Robinson, Sonia Robinson, anything from you?
Thanks, Chris. No, I just want to share how much I've appreciated being a part of the conversation today, and just listening in on the input that's been shared by our districts that are on the text. So just thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the opportunity to present the information for school improvement.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate all your good work and contributions. Mr. Allen Burrow, anything from you, sir?
No, I don't have any further comments, but thank you everyone for your efforts to contribute and participate in this task force.
And is Dr. Vanderford on? I don't know if she still had stepped away.
No, she's in another meeting.
Okay, so all right. Well, then I will thank you all for your great contributions, great discussion. Our my notes are plentiful, so I will synthesize those. We'll get those documented out to you guys, and we will certainly have future meetings where we'll check in on these topics and almost certainly introduce new topics. There's always a lot of important consequential things and accountability for us to take up, and we rely on your advice for that. Hope everybody has a great rest of your Tuesday, and until next time, take care.
Thanks, Chris.